Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here at the Fort Worth Public Library. And I would like to, before we get started, mention to you that on Thursday, the 21st of February at 6 p.m. in this same room, we will be hosting Riley Holloway, visual storyteller, for Black History Month. But now, without any further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for this afternoon for our final World War I lecture in the series. This is Dr. Douglas Harman. He is the owner of Harman Consulting and currently serves as a consultant on tourism with the Dallas-Fort Worth Area Tourism Council. His education includes a PhD from American University and a degree from Nebraska Wesleyan University. Thank you. I can make it.
Can you put that in that thing? Without good friends being here, I'd be really lonely, so thank you for being here. She's going to get me plugged in. Okay. I'm getting worried. This is the most suspenseful part of the presentation. Behind the curtain. There, great. Okay. The title of the presentation is there on the screen. Below it is kind of one of the many ironical statements about World War I. That was by Woodrow Wilson, making the world safe for democracy, which is just, when you think about it and what happened after World War I, it's kind of depressing. But before we get to the further depressing parts of all of this, I'd like to give several thanks. One to Jim Hodgkins and all of the volunteers, the sponsors who put together this entire program. I think many of you have it in your hands there, that has been so, I think, significant. This is the last presentation, really, of this two-part major review about World War I and its impact. And anyway, so Jim has been really good. And secondly, I want to thank the library. And for those of you that kind of admitted as you came in that you hadn't been here for many years, I mean, you probably went to the Carnegie Library down by City Hall and have not been here since. So anyway, but the library has been really, really great. And this facility really, the gallery and the space really is really quite wonderful. But also I want to thank Bob Holmes and Clara Holmes back up there, because they were so important in putting together this whole presentation, the PowerPoint. So anyway, I really, really appreciate what they have done. Well, going on, I know how it works, my goodness. The tragedy of World War I mean, was great in itself, in as much as the 9 million persons who died in World War I. And it was really very sad, and we'll talk about some of the other aspects of it that underscore kind of the tragedy of World War I during the fighting. But in addition to that, you go on to the proposition, which I think is pretty widely held, that the end of World War I really set the stage for World War II. And the 50 million people who died in World War II is just another tragedy built upon another tragedy. And it goes on today, unfortunately. But, to further underscore the tragic aspects of it, during the war, 1/2 of all young French men died in World War I. 1/2 of all of the young men who were of the age to serve in the military died. 1/3 of all of the Germans, young men, died in World War I. So if you kind of think about the situation both in France and in Germany at the end of this terrible war, and you think about the generations going forward and the necessity to, in fact, redevelop those countries, it was really pretty difficult. Also, this picture, and I wished I knew the kind of all of the background. It's German soldiers in battle. But World War I, in terms of the kind of the type of fighting, was really pretty horrible for several reasons. I think everybody is familiar with trench warfare, and what happened was that the lines of fighting got so restricted, and in fact, even after some of these horrific battles, they would go back and forth only a number of feet. Well, at the same time, the accuracy and the power of artillery increased dramatically, so that the artillery of that period and their ability to focus on very specific targets really led to large number of deaths in the trenches. So if you were a soldier of that time, I mean, you were just kind of waiting for your number to, come up. And then if you did go forward in a charge against the other trenches, the machine gun had come into its own, so that you could really suffer tremendous death just going through attacking the other lines. Well, one of the basic issues is really what caused World War I, because I think in the minds of a lot of people, it was just simply aggression by Germany, perhaps, or probably, I would say the vast majority of people in the United States view it that way. But you really need to step back first from and look at the history of Europe, which from the standpoint of Europe was a series of wars that took place. In fact, the greatest attack and conquering of other countries was Napoleon. So here you had a Frenchman who, went all the way into Russia and really basically had conquered really most of the European continent. So from a standpoint of it, if you were a German, you still had the memory of what Napoleon had done, but you also had the other wars, the Franco-Prussian War and several other wars of that time. So another way to look at World War I was that it was, in fact, a continuation of a number of warfare, that took place in Europe. The other thing is as the second point on there, it was a Serbian who killed the Archduke Ferdinand in Serbia. And where is Serbia on this map? Well, you can see Belgium, Germany, France. That's where all the big fighting took place in World War I. You look where is Serbia? It's clear down far away. So it was a Serb who was attacking the heir to the Austria-Hungary throne. So really far away from what emerged as the fighting in World War I. So one has to wonder, well, what's the connection? Well, the connection was this, that Austria demanded that Serbia, in fact, there was a 10-point plan that they had. They demanded that Serbia respond to these 10 points, which basically they did. They admitted, I guess, creating circumstances that might have led to an assassination attempt. But Austria was not satisfied with the response. So when the threat of Austria attacking Serbia took place, this is when Russia gets into it, and Russia, being the one to protect the Serbs, threatens warfare against Austria. Well, Austria, had an agreement with Germany. At the same time, a tri-party agreement was between France, England, and Russia. So when the Russians started mobilizing for attack on Austria, the Germans had an alliance with Austria, so they were going to intervene and did intervene to protect Austria. So it becomes much more complicated picture than just one person getting assassinated. And it was not a German who did the assassination. So going on to the next slide, it's probably a bad thing to do the what-ifs in history. But I think in this case, it's probably an important thing to think about. And in fact, Woodrow Wilson had just gotten reelected. In fact, Woodrow Wilson took advantage of got elected because the Republican Party was split. This is when Teddy Roosevelt was creating his own party, and it failed. He failed to get elected, and in any case, so a Democrat becomes president. The Congress is dominated by the Republicans of that time. So then, think about this. Originally, actually, Wilson's ability or his strength about getting elected was based upon he kept us out of the war. He kept us out of the war. So his strength as a politician and someone who appealed to a large number of the electorate was the fact that he kept us out of the war. And in fact, you think about some of the things that led the United States into the war. You think about the Lusitania, the sinking of the Lusitania, which was a serious event, certainly. But that was in 1914. The United States did not go to war until 1917. So during this period, Woodrow Wilson had been really strongly opposed to going to war. So what changed that whole situation? Well, in the what-ifs, what if the United States had not entered the war? There is a strong belief that peace without victory would have resulted, which in other words, the Allied and the Central Powers would have just finally given up fighting each other because they really were just really unable to go forward. And there would not have been a Versailles Treaty, and there would not have been all the things that we'll talk about that came out of that particular treaty, which I think led to Hitler's rise. So peace without victory, perhaps. What if Wilson had actually carried out his pledge to keep the United States out of the war? There are a number of things that really are important to recognize. The United States, to a large extent, or the United States financiers were really financing a large part of the French and British wartime efforts. J.P. Morgan had loaned $3 billion to France and to England, or just to France, I think, in order to keep the French ability to continue warfare. And during this period of time also, some of the major industries of the United States had in fact really been supplying the arms to Britain and to France. One estimate was that maybe up to 40% of the shells that were used in the fighting by France and England had been produced in the United States. So they obviously got transported over there on ships and were very, very much a part of keeping all of this, going forward. So by United States in 1917, when it finally goes forward and declares war. The match that caused that to happen really was, in fact, the submarine warfare. Well, there are two different ways to look at this, and the submarine warfare had been going on, but Germany, after Lusitania in 1914, Germany said they would restrict it to oh, here comes one of the intellectuals that just came off the street. So anyway, you have a seat. I hope you're okay. Anyway, when the submarine warfare opened up again in early 1917, that was sort of the match that brought the United States in. So anyway, but at the same time that the submarine warfare was going on, that basically the British had a big blockade of all foodstuffs going into Germany. So Germany, by the end of 1918, 1919, was a country that was basically starving. And so that that's another way of looking at really what the blockades that were going on. Well, anyway, and finally, what if Wilson had been a more effective political leader? Particularly when he went to Versailles, and we'll talk more about this, he was viewed with considerable disdain. Not all of which was really appropriate or really appropriate, because he was very idealistic. They viewed him as a stuffy old professor, and you know how old professors get stuffy and stuffier over time. But he was very moralistic, they thought, and so in any case, the fact also that he was not able to deal with the politics of Congress, because Congress never eventually then approved the Treaty of Versailles or or in fact the League of Nations, which came out of all of that. Well, another piece of this that kind of gets overlooked, and you really need to kind of balance this out, and typically, in fact, one of the greatest efforts at propaganda warfare was during this period, and one of the largest manufacturers of that propaganda was, in fact, the British. And there was a number of kind of key British politicians who were behind these things. In fact, if you look at the destroy this mad brute. Well, it's an interesting footnote to really what has become kind of the propaganda warfare of today, really, but villainizing the Germans as, in this case, a guerrilla, and of course the young innocent, I imagine, virgin on his arm certainly is, reflecting the kind of the purity of the American. And in any case, in fact, this is an enlistment poster that was designed by the British that was used in the United States. So it's a pretty sad, kind of way of dehumanizing people and dehumanizing the Germans. Now, the Germans also had their propaganda warfare going on at the same time, so it's not as though they weren't doing some of the very same things. The armistice came, and the 11/11 date was greeted with great enthusiasm by all of the soldiers, because it had been such a brutal kind of warfare going on, and everybody was kind of really wanting it to get over with. But what happened at the armistice? At the end of the armistice, or when the armistice was declared, this is before there'd been an agreement on ending the war, or the things that came along with the Versailles Treaty. But the German army went back to a Germany that was literally starving. because the blockade, the food blockades were still going on and went on for some while until all of the Versailles treaty elements were in fact written. They also went back very angry because from the standpoint of the German soldiers, they felt they had been stabbed in the back. Stabbed in the back was kind of the terminology of the time. And that the politicians and the others had in fact sold them down the river, so to speak, in a way. At the same time, the transition of the German government to the Weimar Republic, of going from a hereditary rulership of the Kaiser to a democracy, was creating a lot of chaos, and that chaos was really resented greatly. So, at the end, one of the things about wars that there tends to be considerable economic problems at the end of a war. So there became worldwide depression, not right after the war. In fact, in the United States, the price of cotton fell dramatically, and thus the whole cotton industry really collapsed overnight because the government wasn't buying cotton to make uniforms. And that all along the way, there are all kinds of things that got turned off immediately as a result. So when the wartime buying stopped, then the economics of the country, or countries really, changed pretty quickly. Okay, this gets us up to Versailles. So a year after the armistice was declared, the nations of the world met in Versailles. Now, when I say the nations of the world met, that's a misnomer also, because it was basically the big three. It was France, Britain, and the United States who really controlled everything that was going on at Versailles. And so that one of the things, in fact, actually it was Lenin who termed made the statement, thieves' kitchen. And what he was saying is that basically the great powers, the colonial powers, were meeting to divide up the world. Because one of the things about the situation right at the end of the war is that the colonial powers had put were controlling numerous other countries all over the world, from China, the Middle East, Africa. And so one of the things that was going to go on is, all right, who got the German colonial places that they had? And that was really kind of a very big thing. One of the other things in all of this was the guilt clause, as it was referred to. That in fact, this whole process of the Versailles Treaty was dictated by the three powers that I mentioned. And then when the Germans were invited to come and discuss, well, they were invited, they thought, to discuss a treaty. What they were presented with was the treaty de facto, and that they were required to, in fact, approve it. In that was what was called the guilt clause, which meant that Germany, not Austria, but Germany had to accept full responsibilities for the war. They were guilty of, in fact, creating the war. Why this is so important is that the German army was already upset about feeling like they'd been stabbed in the back. What this did is just compound the anger in Germany over the fact that they were being blamed for everything, and they had nothing to say about that, or anything they could say. Also, the reparations provision was pretty dramatic. It was $33 billion that Germany was required to pay back. $33 billion. So it was, well, and in determining the reparations, there was a real conflict between Britain and France, because Britain, Clemenceau and France wanted to grind Germany down to nothing. Britain and also the United States had a different view. They wanted to see Germany revive as a trading partner rather than for it to kind of disintegrate. The reparation clause probably didn't turn out to be such a huge thing for Germany, given the hyperinflation that came along in those following years. So, but it was the image of having to pay $33 billion that also created a great anger in Germany. Germany lost 13% of its land surrounding it, basically in the east and on the west. The Rhineland was supposed to be demilitarized, and so a lot of the key resources of Germany were being taken away, or actually part of that was occupied by the French for a period of time when Germany wasn't able to pay part of its reparations at that time. The one thing that, if there was any good aspect, it was the Bolsheviks, because both France, England, and others were so fearful, because you had two Russias during this period of time, which complicates things pretty greatly, which is you had Tsarist Russia at the beginning of the war, and then you had the Bolshevik revolution going on, and the industrialists were very fearful that there was going to be a worldwide communist takeover of their industries. And so the one thing that kind of helped Germany not be totally devastated in terms of its armaments and things like that is that France and England had a greater fear of the Bolsheviks at that point than they had even of the Germans. Well, and if you kind of think about, go forward to the end of World War II and the Marshall Plan, or how the United States treated Japan at the end of World War II. In neither case did they impose the kind of draconian kinds of things upon those countries. They wanted them to be restored. And as a result, you didn't have from either country, either Germany or Japan, this hatred that emanated really out of Germany after World War I. So it was quite a different sort of thing. And also in all of this, and it's a very complicated subject, and my son, Gregory, has tried to explain this all to me, and I'm sure I'm too thick-headed to understand it. But in all of the League of Nations, which came out of the Versailles Treaty, as well as kind of a long period of trying to deal with international law, the main question was, could you outlaw war? And that was kind of one of the things that was kind of debated, and was one of the elements that was in fact as one of the goals of the League of Nations. And so that you could have sanctions against countries that would in fact basically eliminate kind of the ability to go to war and make warfare an illegal activity. And there was also the Kellogg-Brandt Pact that was developed in about 1930 that was also then kind of in that effort. None of these efforts really succeeded, really, but the cartoon is a good one, which is the French saying, here are the terms of the treaty, like it or lump it. And so that was a big part of all of this. Now this leads us up to the death of German democracy. One of the things about democracies is that sometimes the ruling gets very confused when you have multiple parties, which was the case with the Weimar Republic. So the Weimar Republic also then got blamed for the loss of World War I. And the Weimar Republic was the transition from the Kaiser and that form of traditional European governance to one of a democracy. and the democracy really didn't hold together, from the hereditary rule. And Hitler and the Nazis, there's a lot written about that, and probably many of you are very knowledgeable about how he rose from the, actually, I mean, he and Mussolini both wrote their little books. Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, was actually the 2 volumes of it that he wrote when Hitler tried to overthrow the government. It was kind of an inept effort in about 1932 or so, and that failed. But it did give him writing time in jail, which was, I think most authors love to have a little, quiet time in jail to do their best work. But in any case, he wrote Mein Kampf, which is, basically says, the German people aren't very smart, and which was kind of amazing that he expressed it that way. But in any case, he came out. He also emerged as an effective public speaker in the beer halls. And I know, knowing some of you out there, that some of you are big beer drinkers, and you probably have not really tried to excite groups in beer halls, but there's always some possibility in the future for you. In any case, Hitler became very popular as a speaker, ranting and raving about kind of the loss of World War I and who all was to blame and so forth. Well, his party, the National Socialistic Party, which became the Nazi Party, really had only about less than a third of the population supporting that party in voting. But because there were so many other parties also in the Weimar Republic that finally he was given the position of chancellor, which was a strategic mistake in retrospect, because he then really, it was part of his seizing of power that came. And you had the fire at the Reichstag, that in fact was one of the things, and I guess to this day people still are puzzled about who actually caused the fire. There's still debate about that. But in any case, it created then the basis for what was called the Enabling Act, which was basically to take full power, dictatorial power of Germany during this emergency period. And so, in any case, that's what he did, and that's when he became really the dictator of Germany. Now, those of you that have heard of Netflix, I guess, and if you're afflicted with Netflix, there's one program that we watched with great interest, and it's about this period in Germany. It's called the program, or the series of programs, called Babylon Berlin. And it really reflects very well, I think, the conflict between the urban areas and the rural areas. And it reflected also how the values were changing during this period of time. And so that at the same time that the Bolsheviks were trying to come into Germany and take control in Germany by organizing labor. And so, in any case, if you find it's quite a kind of an really interesting, well-done historical series on Netflix. Well, this brings us to kind of this next phase. Well, actually, Mussolini was the teacher of Hitler, because Mussolini's rise to power and his development of fascism really becomes then the blueprint for what Hitler did. And in Italy, you had a kind of a different situation, but you had kind of really great unemployment. Italy was struggling from the standpoint of being divided up into kind of a lot of different sectors. Mussolini had his book too, which is called My Diary, which is even more boring than Mein Kampf. So I would not recommend it as great literature. But in any case, Mussolini and his tactics really mirrored very much what Hitler ended up doing. So that the fascism, the radical authoritarian kind of suppression of really the press, the judiciary, and leading right exactly to control the courts and the legislature. That was Mussolini, and Mussolini, he like Hitler had been a soldier in World War I, was angry about how everything turned out, but it's interesting. It didn't take too many years when Mussolini was at the doorstep of Hitler, asking Hitler to save him, because his power really collapsed pretty quickly. But he, like the colonial efforts, you had in particular, in fact, fascism is a Italian term for bundling things together. And what Mussolini was most interested in doing is restoring a mythical past, the past of Roman Empire, and how the Roman Empire was such a great thing, and he wanted to make Italy great again, you might say. But in any case, that didn't last too many years. I mean, his foray into Abyssinia turned out to be kind of a big disaster, and some of his other invasions were not very good either. So I don't know. I guess jokes are still made about the prowess of the Italian army, but in any case, it turned out not to be very successful. So this brings us then to the features of Hitler's fascism, and they're listed there, and they're really the authoritarian state. Hitler was very good about self-promotion, and in his speeches, nationalism is a key in both Germany and Italy, where that's the kind of the number one kind of thing that is promoted. And hate is a key thing, because in this case, it's the hatred toward the others, the hatred toward the Jews, the Slavs, the Gypsies, and so all of those were responsible for the difficulties that Germany had been facing. And the Aryan superiority, one of the ironies I've always thought is, while Hitler was promoting this image, and you've seen it in probably the old posters of the Aryan, the blonde, tall, muscular man, and think about all of the Hitler and his associates. None of them were tall, blonde men. So in a way, I mean, you think about, whether it's Goering or Himmler or Goebbels, I mean, they all certainly didn't fit that model of the Aryan superior race. But populism, of really inciting the lesser educated people to be angry at the nation, or angry at and demanding, in fact, there be a strong leader. And that was really a big part of what it, and then that connects to the militarism that, in fact, created then full employment, you could say, of not only putting soldiers, because the Germany in about 1935 had compulsory military service. So at the same time, you had to produce the arms, the cannons, the tanks, and all the other things. And Germany was pretty good about avoiding the strictures of the Versailles Treaty from the standpoint of re-equipping an army. The other things, the propaganda which Himmler and the others used was pretty dramatic, and corruption, which is one of the other ironies in all this, of course, of the populism of attacking the people of power, but Hitler had a wonderful ability to have alliances with the Krupps and the other major industrialists. So So they were not really true to their word as to what they were supporting. Oops. I'm stuck on Hitler. That's pretty depressing. Oops. Okay. Well, going on to something that is really not quite in the same sequence, but when we talked about Versailles, the colonial powers had staked out places all over the world, as colonial powers would do, because they wanted the raw material, they wanted the trading kind of ability, and so that, in fact, going back to the reason why France and Germany France and England were upset with Germany. France, on the one hand, had really been losing population at the same time that Germany had grown in population. Germany also was becoming an international maritime trading company or country, and so England was mad about them becoming kind of a bigger competitor on the world market. Well, then you look at the world that came out of this, because during World War I, during the fighting, of course, there was less fighting in the Middle East, but it was beginning the attack on the Ottoman Empire. In fact, the Ottoman Empire is quite an amazing thing to read about, and I certainly, till I kind of delved into this, knew less than most people, I think. But in any case, because they had at one point, from Europe going up into Hungary, all across the Mediterranean, the northern Mediterranean, and into Spain. That was really the Ottoman Empire, the Muslims coming into the rest of the world. But and they fell back out of Spain, and they fell back out of Hungary. But even so, at the time of World War I and the fighting, that in fact they still had hundreds of thousands of square miles that basically was the area that you can see how it wraps down kind of all around Saudi Arabia. It goes across the northern African coast. So in any case, this is where kind of the Lawrence of Arabia kind of created a stir, because what Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, was doing, he was trying to bring the Arabs to fight against the Turks and the Ottoman Empire. And certainly it's one of the great movies. If you've not seen it, it's really worth looking at. But in any case, but part of that, the implicit or the actual agreement, according to Lawrence, was that once the Ottoman Empire was defeated, that the Arabs would get self-rule. Well, that did not happen. And so there was a lot of unhappiness and anger about that. There was also great frustration that you think about this whole world that you see in kind of the orange was Muslim. And so basically Britain and France in particular imposed, the Christian, view of controlling a Muslim world, which led to an awful lot of anger and frustration. And then also out of the Versailles Treaty and the League of Nations came what was called the mandates. So the League of Nations had a whole series of mandates which were individual countries such as Great Britain, France, and others were in fact given authority over individual countries. In fact, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, out of that came 7 new countries. Well, in fact, even at the time, the British realized, that the Middle East was really a quagmire. So the idea of creating all these new countries was going to be fraught with a lot of problems. Also, Churchill, who plays a big role in all of this, he's the lead British person that in this part of the world. And Churchill faced a couple of challenges. On the one hand, he wanted to control, he wanted the best arrangements for the British in these various countries, such as Egypt and Syria and other places. But at the same time, Britain had a big economic problem. They were deeply in debt, and Britain could not, in fact, have troops all over the Middle East because they just couldn't afford it. So, in fact, what they wanted to do was, in fact, have a less expensive dominance of those countries through air power and armored cars, so that the air bases that the British maintained control of, that would in fact be the deterrent against these countries, trying to have too much independence. Well, and before all that, in 1916, the Sykes-Picot, two individuals, one British and one French, had really already designed, wrote the lines on the map that divided up the whole Middle East between France and England. So a lot of what we have today in that part of the world is as a result of what was done. And in all of that, there are certain things, think about the problems today with the Kurds, that what could have been done is to in fact give the Kurds some country of their own. That was not done, and as a result, we still have this fight between the Kurds and Turkey that continues to go on. Then this brings us to kind of how the World War I affected all of this whole area, and you think about the kind of the fighting that's still going on, and in a way, you could say that the issue of the cost of having occupation in this part of the world is pretty great for Western powers. On the other hand, the Western powers wants the authority over things. The League of Nations mandates basically meant that a lot of these areas, new countries that were coming into existence, in fact, had the authority over these countries, and these countries could not become independent until the mandate colonial power agreed to it, and then that was taken back to the League of Nations. And in any case, the other thing, if there's a key date in all of this, it's 1918. In 1918, the British fleet transferred from coal-powered ships to oil-powered ships. And it was at that point in time that the British really realized how important keeping oil fields for their military might was going to be. And so that's when, in fact, the oil of the Middle East became really one of the key things. Well, to kind of wrap this up, I think out of all of this, there's one thing. It's easy to start wars, and it's damn difficult to, in fact, close up the war and have a settlement that doesn't create another war. To me, that's kind of the overwhelming kind of thing, and you see a lot of parallels in the issues today confronting, the United States and its position in the Middle East. We also need to really recognize fascist movements, as in fact Madeleine Albright's book is really a great book. In fact, there's a little bibliography up on the table up there, and her book is really good from the standpoint of looking at the world today, from the standpoint of what fascism is growing and what the threat it is. The nationalism is, you think about nationalism today, and you think about it in the United States and then elsewhere, and you go back to the history of Europe. Europe is a history fraught with fights, conflicts, and war, and primarily around kind of nationalistic kind of views of what are, your power, what are your boundaries, and your Lebensraum kinds of thing, of where each country can kind of define what space they really needed to be successful. The other thing that's pretty complicated, I think, is the issue of economies becoming too dependent upon warfare, where in fact, we see it ourselves certainly in a very big way. The amount of money that we spend on armament compared to the amount of money spent on trying to stay out of war is a pretty dramatic contrast. In fact, the CIA has their annual assessment of world issues, and one of the ones that they have identified repeatedly is the impact of climate change on the likelihood of other wars. And just the loss of water resources is going to cause any number of wars in the years ahead. So one can make the argument that there ought to be a ratio of what you spend on military things to what you spend on intervention to, in fact, avoid warfare. And I think that's one of the other things that really is so important. Well, anyway, the bottom line is really it's World War I was really a depressing event in world history that has unleashed a lot of things that continue to be with us today. And I'm sorry to be a downer on a Saturday afternoon that's already cold and glum out there, but what else? You didn't have anything else to do, so anyway, it's good that you came in here. At least it's warm, but anyway, I want to thank you all for being here. I don't know if there's any time for any questions, or the library will throw us out. You know how they are. They just are so unreasonable all the time. Oh, okay. All right. Are there any questions? Or guess not. Okay, then anyway, Judy will answer, my wife, who has had to live through this effort of trying to understand all these different things. She has more insight into it, so you can ask Judy the questions that you are otherwise afraid to ask. So anyway, thank you very much. Thank you, library, for having us.